Wales has about 3 million people. It's a relatively small part of the United Kingdom, and it is part of the United Kingdom, which includes England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Most of the people in Wales speak English, and if you were to travel there, you would have no trouble speaking English the whole time you were there. But there are still in Wales about 500,000 Welsh speakers, and the country is officially bilingual. So you will see a lot of that as you travel around. You'll see road signs and museum information and all kinds of places throughout the country where you will see both English and Welsh listed. And you will occasionally hear Welsh spoken, although more in certain parts of the country than in other. Obviously, it has a very strong national identity because of this, because Wales has been its own very distinct place for literally centuries. What we're going to look at tonight, the last program that we did, we kind of started down here along the south coast, went through Cardiff and Pembrokeshire and the Brecon Beacons, worked our way around the coast, way down at the end out to St. David's, and ended up in Aberystwyth. Tonight, what we're going to be doing is continuing up to the north part of Wales through Snowdonia National Park, seeing some of the castles and seaside places that are along this area, and then we're going to come back down the interior, which is very pleasant, very rural, and we're going to end up coming back down, making a complete circle all the way back down, crossing the Bristol Channel, and heading back into England. So the first place we're going to see is an interesting little one that we stopped in called Dolgellau. I won't even attempt to pronounce it in true Welsh. So if anyone speaks Welsh, please forgive me for my pronunciation. It's really a beautiful market town. It's at the southern end of the Snowdonia region, so right before the mountains start to be seen on the horizon. It's at the foot of Cadair Idris, which is the second highest peak in Wales, and it looms up over in the background. The thing that's so beautiful about this town is the architecture, most of which is in the kind of stone that you see here. There's a few other interesting old buildings as well. For a long time, this town was a market town that was the focus of the wool trade in the area. There's obviously a lot of sheep in Wales. And it was also a gold mining town, which is kind of interesting in this part of the world. But it's a pleasant place to stop. Unfortunately, we wanted to stay there in all of these. There are all kinds of terrific bed and breakfasts and pensions and places that you can stay, but there was not a single room to be had in the entire town when we were there. And that was because we completely missed the fact that it was a bank holiday weekend. So, of course, everyone in the UK was heading off for the weekend for vacation and had booked all of the hotels for 50 miles in every direction. But we did spend some time walking around. The town is absolutely beautiful. You can see it's built, most of the buildings are built from this wonderful dark stone, granite, that is very typical of the area. So if you ever are in that area and lucky enough to snag a room, it's a beautiful spot to stay. And it makes a very good base for exploring the Snowdonia region because it's very convenient to that. And here's a little bit of this landscape of Snowdonia, which we had to zip through very quickly because the closest place that we could find to stay overnight was 50 miles away. So we did a quick run to the north coast and then came back to Snowdonia after that. I think we got the very last room available in all of northern Wales that particular weekend. And where we found it is in the largest of Wales seaside resorts. This is way at the very north coast of Wales. It's a beautiful Georgian-style seaside town with about 20,000 people in it. And here you can see the beautiful beach in the center of town with this long promenade with all the grand hotels, most of which were built in the 19th century. It's called Llandudno, and it's a very popular place, not only for foreign visitors, but also for Brits, because it's a very typical English, British, I should say, seaside destination. The other thing that makes it really nice is how close it is to Snowdonia. So it has a little bit of the seaside, but within about half an hour, you can be exploring the high mountains of Snowdonia, far away from civilization. This is a nice view from the beach, looking back into the center of town where there are all these beautiful buildings, many of which are rentals. They're apartments that you can rent, Airbnbs, and also just really nice Georgian hotels. There's also a wonderful pier. This pier was built in 1878. It's almost half a mile long, and it has all kinds of very typical British things to do, games to play, little restaurants where you can get fish and chips and ice cream and so forth. And there's an arcade way out at the end. You may be able to see off in the distance, way on the horizon, are a whole range of wind turbines that are one of the largest, in fact, I think it's the second largest in the world, offshore wind farms that generates an enormous amount of electrical power for Britain. This is a close-up of the pier. If the weather's nice, like it was when we were there, it's just a terrific place to stroll around and feel very, very British. Looking back, we stayed in this grand hotel, which is the one that you can see kind of at the base of the pier, right on the coast. It's not quite as grand as it used to be. It was a little frumpy, but in a way that I kind of enjoy. It clearly used to be one of the Grand Dame hotels of London, and nowadays it's more, a little more like Faulty Towers, if you remember that. But it was very inexpensive, and as I said, beggars can't be choosers. At the particular night that we were looking, it had the only available room anywhere in North Wales, so we took it. But as it turned out, we had a terrific view. It was a great spot, and we had a wonderful time. Here's a romantic couple enjoying the pier, but again, a close-up of this wind farm that you can see off in the distance. It's called the Gwyntimor Offshore Wind Farm, and my notes here say, I correct myself, it's the fourth largest wind farm in the world. Most of the large ones are in Northern Europe, where there is a tremendous amount of wind, not to mention countries that are very avid in promoting wind generation of electricity. So there's 160 turbines off the coast, and they generate a total of an incredible total of 576 megawatts, which supplies an enormous amount of electricity for this area. The North Sea and all of the area around Britain in the ocean gets significant constant wind through much of the year. So it's a good place for this kind of energy development. And just some more scenes from around the town. It has a wonderful center with a lot of public amenities. There are really nice restaurants, a lot of nice shopping streets. There are some good pedestrian areas as well. And all of it is fronted by this beautiful beach with a promenade that goes all along it. And at night, we had a great view from our hotel because we were kind of on the end, the tip of the little peninsula, looking back at the town across the harbor. So there was this gorgeous view of the entire seaside lit up. And the very same view in the morning looks like this, with the sun coming from over the mountains. Very different atmosphere. The other thing that's nice to see right in this area is something called the Great Orme, which is a big headland. It's about 700 feet high. It's this huge bump that's right off around the corner. You can see kind of right there, hidden behind the hill, you can see the waterfront of the town and the developed area behind it. This is a headland made of limestone. And it's a fascinating place to explore. And you can basically, it's a bit of a long walk, but you can easily drive there. And if you're up for a bit of a walk, you can hike up to the top. The settlement of this spot goes back to Neolithic times. And you can kind of imagine why, because it's very protected. It has a great view of the area. But there's a lot of interesting things to do there. Here we are um, getting ready to go down into a Bronze Age copper mine. This is a copper mine that dates back 4,000 years. So we're not talking about the 19th century or the Industrial Revolution. This was very early Neolithic settlers who discovered that they could mine copper and use it to develop metallurgy from that time period. They actually, the thing that's incredible about this, you can go down several levels in the mine. The people who lived here at the time built a number of different levels of mine. And what they were trying to retrieve out of it was malachite ore. You may be familiar with malachite as a sort of a precious stone. It's very beautiful green and is used in jewelry and other things. But if you take malachite and you smelt it, you can get copper out of it, and that's what they did. So you can explore the mines. The thing that's kind of interesting to think about this is that this was a pre-industrial civilization, one where all of this was being done 2,000 years before the Romans even. So most of these tunnels were dug essentially by hand with no kind of mechanical tools whatsoever. So it was really an incredible site to visit. In addition to the mine, it's just a beautiful place to explore with these gorgeous views up and down the coast. And there's actually over here in this little spot that you can see hidden off in the background, because it's limestone, another thing that you can see all over the area are fossils from fossils of shells and other kinds of things that you can find just laying around in the ground. It's very, very interesting. And there's also herds of wild goats wandering around. You may run into some of those as well. It's a very windswept and bare place, but an awfully nice getaway if you want to just do something a little more adventurous and get some exercise out of the town of Llandudno. If you don't feel like driving or walking to the top, there is this really nice historic tramway that will take you all the way up in just a few minutes. And the view, if nothing else, the view is just lovely. You can look all the way down. You can see the mountains of Snowdonia off in the distance and a beautiful view of Llandudno and its beach. Very close to this, a little further to the west. Is that right? Yes, the west. I'm going to show you a couple of different castles that are well worth seeing in Wales. Conwy is one of the biggest ones. And it's kind of an interesting story because many of these castles, which are now major tourist destinations in Wales, were actually built by the English to keep the Welsh out. And these go back to King Edward I, who built most of these castles. He was the son of Henry III. And the whole point of building all of these castles is that he was trying to establish them as English strongholds to basically conquer Wales for the English. The irony, of course, now is that these English castles are now major tourist attractions for the Welsh economy. But they were originally designed to safeguard the English and keep the Welsh out. But there's several different ones sprinkled throughout Wales, and many of them are among the best preserved and biggest castles to see in the UK. Conwy is not far from Llandudno. It's at the mouth of the Conwy River, appropriately. And you can clamber all over the towers and get really nice views up and down the river estuary. It was built in the late 13th century, along with the town walls, which enclose the modern town of Conwy. And in addition to the castle, an interesting addition to it is leading from the castle across the Conwy River are 3 bridges that are immediately adjacent to each other, which is kind of interesting. The one in the middle is a 19th century, like 1820s or so, bridge that was built by Thomas Telford, who we're going to hear about a couple more times in this presentation. He was an important engineer at that time period. The modern car bridge that was built in the 20th century is on the left. That's the one that you would use if you're driving back and forth. And the odd-looking one on the right is what's called a tubular bridge. It was built in the 1840s for railways. And it's tubular because it actually is completely enclosed, almost like a covered bridge that has the sides enclosed as well. So these two bridges on the in the middle on the right are actually quite historic and go back to the Industrial Revolutionary times. Here's just some more views of the castle. It has 8 huge towers and private royal chambers. It's considered one of the best examples of medieval castle architecture in Europe. And it also has a very nice view over the town. Conwy is a very pretty town, aside from the castle. You can see typical Welsh weather that we were experiencing on that particular day, not unlike what we're going through today in Massachusetts. In addition to the castle, Conwy, the town, has some beautiful Elizabethan houses from that time period, and Victorian ones as well. So it's a pretty town just to wander around. And there are some homes in the village that you can visit. Probably the most well-known of which is this one called Place Mar, which is an excellent example of an Elizabethan townhouse. It was built in 1576 and has been completely restored as a museum. It's huge, and it's unusual in the sense that its size is the result of it being a home of an extremely wealthy merchant at that time period. So it's not specifically typical of buildings that would have been built there. But it does give you an idea of what a wealthy landowner and business person would have lived in at the time. And the interior has been completely restored very nicely. And the day we were there, they were having, again, because it was a bank holiday weekend, they were doing all kinds of festival things and had special events. So there were activities going on in the house as well. The restoration was completed in the 1990s, and for a house of its time period, it's pretty large. It has 20 different rooms. Here's the kitchens. You'll note the leeks, which are, of course, the symbol of Wales. And the house has a courtyard and several different levels. I think it had at least 3 or 4 stories. The little thing that you see on the right, you can probably guess what this is. It's just a hole in the wall in a small closet off of one of the upstairs bedrooms. But what's important about it is it's indoors. And in the 1570s, indoor plumbing or indoor facilities were not terribly common. So that this is another example of why this is a wealthy person's house. The decoration in the place is beautiful. The plaster work that you can see on the walls and ceiling is original. It's been restored, but it is original and still in very good condition. And the largest room in the house, which is way up high, it's actually on I believe, the 3rd floor of the house, is the banquet hall. And there are period rooms decorated with furniture from that time period. Most of the furnishings you're seeing are not original to the home, but are appropriate for the time period that and typical of what would have been in a home of this type. I found this was enjoyable. I found it in a lot of historic homes in England. These are dried teasels that are kind of prickly, and they put them on all of the furniture to make sure that the tourists don't sit on it, on the historic furniture. Note, this is back in that grand hall on the top floor. Note that the ER, which stands for Elizabeth Regina, Queen Elizabeth, this was Elizabeth I, who actually reigned during the period when the house was originally built. and a view from, if you go way up into the top, there is a tower in this house, and you can see all the way back over to the castle, which dominates the other side of town. This interesting little house, which you can see from the sign, claims to be the smallest house in Great Britain, is only 2 meters wide. It's actually quite old, goes back to the 16th century, and somebody lived in it until 1900. There was a man at that time who lived in it and who was finally kicked out because he had such poor hygiene that the town officials made him leave. Now it's just a cute little tourist attraction that you can stick your head in if you're interested. And right around the corner is a very typical British phone box that you see all over the UK. But what you might notice if you can read the sign up at the top is with the advent of cell phones, of course, a lot of the old-fashioned phone booths are no longer really as necessary as they used to be. So this one's been converted into a defibrillator. You can also see a litter box here, and you'll notice here's an example of where you will see both Welsh language and English, which is very common throughout Wales, and even more so in the north, where the northern parts of Wales tend to have higher percentages of people who are native speakers of Welsh. They obviously don't speak it to tourists, but you might hear it on the street and in shops as people are talking to each other. Very close to this area is another interesting engineering feat back to Thomas Telford. I mentioned him before with that other bridge. It goes over the Menai Strait, which is not terribly wide. It's just, you can see how wide it is here with the bridge that crosses it, but it separates mainland Wales from the Isle of Anglesey, which is a beautiful, very rural part of Wales that you can explore by crossing one of 2 bridges. This is one of the 2, and it was built by Thomas Telford in 1826. So it's a very early bridge to be designed in this suspension style. The other bridge that goes to Anglesey is the Britannia Bridge, which is a little bit later, but still 19th century. It was built in the 1850s by a different engineer named Stevenson, and it is a tubular railway bridge like the other one that we saw in downtown Conway. This one was completely rebuilt though, because there was a fire and it was damaged. So in the 19th century, it was, I'm sorry, in the 1970s, it was completely rebuilt as both a rail bridge and a road bridge. If you do bother to cross over into Anglesey, you may have an opportunity to visit the village with the second longest place name in the world. If you're curious, the first one is in New Zealand. And I won't even attempt to pronounce it. Obviously, they get a lot of tourist mileage out of having a name this long. The larger letters, Llanfairpwllgwyngyll, is the more normal name that the town goes by. But the full official name of the town is the long one below, which means St. Mary's Church in a hollow of white hazel near the rapid whirlpool of the Church of St. Cecilia with a red cave. To be honest, most of the people who live anywhere near here call it Llanfair. And the incredibly long name was actually really designed to attract tourists, which it does. This is the train station, and you can see they make a lot out of it. Another one of the big castles built by King Edward in the 13th century, and this is one of the biggest, is called Carnarvon. And it's very different from the other ones that we've seen in that the towers aren't round. Most of them are either square or angular. And the other thing you'll notice is there's some interesting horizontal banding, which is just a design thing that they did when they built the castle. It's another town about the size of Conway. And if you're into medieval castles, it's a great place to stop. This was used more famously in 1969 for the investiture of the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. And that ceremony took place here. Here's a model where you can see the castle and just how huge it is compared to the town, the original town with the walls. And here's a modern view looking out over the castle to the modern town that is contained within those walls. And again, it was fun to be there on a holiday weekend because a lot of the structures in the interior of the courtyard have disappeared over the centuries, but it now is a nice open space where they were having all kinds of activities for kids and families. Despite the rain, a lot of people were having fun, and in the museum, in the towers of the castle itself, are a number of really, really well done museums. So even in lousy weather, there's an enormous amount to see at this castle, and you can explore almost every little section of it. You can climb the top of every tower. If you have kids with you, it's a fantastic place to poke around. Kids always love castles, and as do grown-up kids. So it's a great place for them to visit, and there's usually activities for them. You can see the low tide in the estuary along the strait from the view from the top of the tower. The entire stretch of this Menai Strait that this castle sits on is tidal. It's not really a river, it's just the water that separates it from separates the mainland from Anglesey. So the tides are actually quite high there. And it was really crowded with all kinds of people having fun. This gives you an idea of just how huge the castle is. I loved this. Here was a grandfather battling it out with his son in true medieval fashion. Now, if you head southward and inland a little bit, you come to Snowdonia, which is the first of Wales' 3 national parks. It's a very mountainous region, the highest parts of Wales, and among the highest in all of Britain. The highest peak is about 3,500 feet, which for New England isn't that big when you go up to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, but for Britain, it's very high, and it is a very rugged area and very rural. There's a lot of hiking, a lot of adventure things that you can do. But even if you don't have an interest in that, it's just a glorious place to drive around because the landscape is stunning, particularly almost ironically in bad weather. We were there during a kind of 2 or 3 days of misty gray, cloudy weather, and Snowdonia was just beautiful in it. The one thing we couldn't do was go all the way up to the top of Mount Snowdon because it would have been completely fogged in and we wouldn't see anything. But the other areas around there were just very beautiful, bleak, but still very atmospheric. There's a lot of mountain lakes and a good bit of forest. So if you want to kind of get away and enjoy nature, this is the place to do it. Next on the list was a place that we had booked ahead of time, and we're very lucky to be able to get there at the time that we were traveling, because this is a place that only has 2 rooms. So you have to book it well in advance if you want to stay there. And I had read about this ahead of time. It's called Wither Castle, and it's an old manor house on the Conwy River, although quite a bit inland. If you follow the Conwy River, eventually you come out at Conwy, the castle that we already saw. But this is an old manor house that dates back to the 16th century and was connected with a family known as the Wynn family, W-Y-N-N. And they were a major, powerful family in North Wales. They, in fact, were the same family that owned the big mansion that we looked at, the Elizabethan mansion in Conwy called Plas Mawr. It was different branches of the same family that owned these two places. This one has a fascinating story, in addition to just being beautiful. It was purchased by a couple, a very young couple named Peter Welford and Judy Corbett in the 1990s. They, in fact, published a book, which is, if you can get a hold of it, it's a delightful read about their experiences as a young couple buying this decrepit castle and fixing it up. It was quite literally falling down when they bought it. And they have spent the last 30 years, more or less, doing extensive renovations. And they now have 2 rooms that they rent out for guests as Airbnb rooms. And so if you stay there, the most you will see is perhaps 2 other guests and Judy and Peter. And it was a delightful place to stay. We stayed there for 2 nights. The gardens are gorgeous. The house is beautiful. And just talking to them about their experiences renovating such an incredible place. This was the room that we stayed in. And you can see, even though it has most modern conveniences, they have completely furnished it with appropriate furniture and rugs and decorative arts and so forth. They even have 2 wonderful dogs that will keep you company if you're interested. And you will get served breakfast, homemade breakfast, in this wonderful dining room, breakfast room with a roaring fire going. You will get to tour the rest of the house and talk to them about it as well. And the gardens, of course, are just stunning. I'm going to talk about the peacocks in a minute. So Judy is the one who wrote the book. It's called Castles in the Air, if you're interested, by Judy Corbett. And it is owned by a number of libraries in this area. I'm not sure if Chelmsford has it, but you could certainly borrow it on interlibrary loan if you're interested. And even if you don't have any interest in actually going there, if you enjoy humorous stories about people dealing with restoration of antique homes, this one takes the cake. But it's also a touching story. They had some very interesting experiences getting to know people and taking on a project that was obviously way over their heads, but they managed to work their way through it. And it's a beautifully written story. The house has had resident peacocks, and still does, since about the 1820s. Right now, Peter and Judy have about 25 peacocks, and they wander freely around the gardens. At times in the history of the house, there have been as many as 100 peacocks. And you will hear them because they do make noise, particularly at odd hours of the night and early in the morning. You can see one sitting up here. There's some lovely topiary. We had a good couple of days there, because the first day we were there was this beautiful Welsh mist and fog and very atmospheric. And then the second day we were there, we woke up and the sun was brilliantly shining. So we got to see the house in 2 completely different personalities, which was very nice for us. Of course, with all the wet climate in Wales, everything is green. So the gardens are gorgeous. There are cedar trees all over the property, some of which are several hundred years old. And through most of the gardens, you can see the turrets and chimneys of the house off in the distance. And you're always bound to run into a peacock. This part, looking to the back of the house, is called the Dutch garden. And it has these huge, these are yew trees, these things that look like gumdrops. They're a good 20 feet high, and wide lawns and fountains. And you have, if you stay there, you're welcome to wander around all over the gardens. Judy and Peter live in one small part of the house that they have converted into a more comfortable living space. And most of the house that you see has actually been restored over the years to its period style. The east wing extension that you see off here, the one that's covered with ivy, is where the dining room is on the ground floor. And there's an interesting story about that. The paneling, there was beautiful wood paneling in there that was removed decades ago by William Randolph Hearst in the United States, who was buying up all kinds of historic artifacts and architectural salvage from country houses and castles around Europe in particular for his homes, particularly San Simeon in the United States, out in California. Many of the things that he bought, he never ended up actually using, and they stayed in storage. And there's a fascinating story which Judy describes in her book about how they managed to eventually track down in a warehouse in New York the original paneling from the dining room, and were able, with the help of the British government and the United States officials as well, to repatriate the entire room full of unused paneling back to Winter Castle, where it was reinstalled in a very important ceremony where they completely redid the room. And even Prince Charles showed up to inaugurate that, because he has a particular interest in historic preservation. So it was very exciting for them to have the Prince come and inaugurate their restored dining room. The room that we stayed in is this one here, right over the front gate, and the entire building is covered with wisteria. I think it's worth it, if you travel to a place like this, to treat yourself at least once or twice to an unusual place to stay like this. The parts of the house that are used by Judy and Peter, aside from the part that they live in, which is actually down in the basement, are the areas way up on the top floor. Judy is a writer, and Peter also does bookbinding and some very detailed crafts. So they have studios that they work with up there, but the entire rest of this building is all period rooms that you can visit when you're staying with them. The house is in a valley where the Conway River runs through, and it's a very pastoral and more or less flat valley. So there's a lot of sheep farming, and you can walk across the river to the nearest major town, which is the town of Longworst, where there are restaurants and shops and other things you can see. There's this, I loved this house, completely overgrown. If you think you have roofing problems, be glad you don't have this house. And the bridge that you get to cross over is this one here. Here's the Conway River, several miles before it actually gets out to the coast. So we walked over to find a place to eat dinner, and came back and enjoyed curling up in a medieval castle, essentially, which is very comfortable. And they've gone to great pains to make every part of the house a very beautiful and comfortable place to stay. The only thing that you might have to worry about is the peacocks, which, as I mentioned, are all over, wandering all over the place, not indoors, but everywhere. The interesting thing about the peacocks is that they have been part of a study that I believe it was the University of Swansea either Cardiff or Swansea was studying them, because the interesting thing about these peacocks is that they've kind of become a very insular community. This is the same genetic stock of peacocks from the 1820s. So despite the fact that they could freely wander away from the castle, they don't. And so they have been, while we were there, they all had little, very tiny little monitors on the back of their necks that were allowing the researchers to study their movements and their calls and their behaviors, to try and figure out why these peacocks have kind of become semi-domesticated, because they are not clipped in a way that would prevent them from flying off if they want, but they just don't. They have been living here for almost 200 years. So here's the morning when the castle becomes completely different with the sun on it. And the misty green gardens become sunny green gardens. Right across the street from the castle is Widder Chapel, which was built for the family back in the 1600s on a hill across the road. And it's a very pleasant little chapel with this beautiful primitive painted ceiling that depicts the creation and the Trinity and the Last Judgment, which you can kind of see up on the roof. I have to say this was probably one of my favorite experiences in all of Wales, just because it was such an unusual place, so private, because other than one other couple that was there, we basically had the place to ourselves, except for the people who ran it, who were very happy to talk with us about their experiences. This bridge that I showed you before, here's a nicer view of it in the sun, was also built by the exact same family, the Wynne family, in the 1600s, and designed by the very famous English architect Inigo Jones, who you might have heard of. Twilight is also a very nice time there, as you can just sit on a bench, watch the sun go down, and have peacocks wander around. For something completely different, as you head down through the Snowdonia region, smack in the center of what is otherwise a very natural park, is this town, which was the focus of the slate mining industry until the early 20th century. Blaenau Festiniog, which really started to decline about 100 years ago or so, if not earlier. You can still see slag heaps throughout the entire town. But if you're interested in this kind of industrial heritage, the town actually does thrive on tourism now, because although there is still a little bit of the company still exists, the Welsh Slate Company. Really, all they do now is produce very smaller quantities of very high quality slate that they use for roofing of historic homes and things like that. But it's really a shadow of the former size of the industry back in the 19th century. But it's an interesting place to drive through, because you can see these huge slag heaps of slate by the side of the road. And throughout this area, you will see a lot of that other evidence of the industrial heritage of Snowdonia, like you can see here. One of the most popular things to see in all of Wales, and it's a little strange because it's not particularly Welsh, it's not even, it's totally unique, is this odd little holiday village called Port Marion, which was designed and built by a guy named Sir Clough Williams Ellis. And it's actually a 20th century phenomenon. He started in the 1920s, and it was worked on right up until the 1970s. And it was specifically designed to be like a Mediterranean style town, an Italian style seaside town. Now it's a tourist attraction. And you almost like a little mini Disney World. But it's a beautiful spot, um, right on the ocean, perched up high. There are wonderful walking trails through the gardens and all these unusual little buildings that were specifically designed to create an atmosphere of this fake Mediterranean style town on the coast of Wales. Most of the houses that you see as you walk around are either privately owned by people who've lived there or own the properties there for a very long time. Some of them can be rented out. It is possible to stay in some of them, although it's so popular, particularly in the summer season, that you'd have to book way in advance. But it's perfectly possible to just stop by for the day and just wander around. We were lucky to be there on a pleasant afternoon. There's restaurants and cafes and ice cream shops and boating. It's an odd little, it's not an amusement park per se, because there's no rides and that sort of thing, but it's just an unusual place to stop by and rent a boat, get an ice cream, stop in a tea shop and get a scone, what have you. But it's completely unlike anything else you'll see anywhere else in Wales. And it's worth the afternoon if you can go, particularly if the weather is pleasant, because it's very brightly colored the way a Mediterranean style town would be. It's not modeled after any particular place, but all of the buildings are supposed to convey a little bit of the sense of the sunny South that is not typical of this part of the British Isles. And it looks out over this wide estuary where you can go walking, sailing, and so forth. There's some lovely botanical gardens too that you can walk through in the forest that have follies like these Japanese and Chinese pagodas and so forth. Back in Snowdonia, we stopped in a little town called Llanberis, which is a very tiny little town between two big mountain lakes. And what you can see here is Dolbadarn Castle, which, unlike the other ones I've shown you so far, is actually Welsh. This one was not built by Edward. It was built by Llewellyn the Great in the early 13th century. And it's in the center of this area where there's lots of adventure outdoor activities. So if you're into hiking and skiing and that sort of thing, there are train rides up to the top of Mount Snowdon. It's kind of a central place where you can stay and be very conveniently located to all those kinds of things if you want to do all the national park activities. And again, as I said, even if you don't have time or aren't interested in things that are that strenuous, just driving through Snowdonia is beautiful. The landscape is stunning. And again, you can see just why this was such an area that was important for mining, coal mining, slate mining, and so forth, because there's rocks pretty much everywhere. Even built into strange things like this. This is called the Ugly House, and it has a mysterious history. It's in the middle of nowhere. There are a number of different legends about it, and nobody knows quite for sure what happened there. It may go back to the 15th century, or some people think it was built as late as the 19th century. But what makes it interesting is just the fact that it's built out of these enormous blocks of stone that are just piled up, rather than the more sophisticated stone building that you would expect to see. And of course, nowadays, it's just a tea shop. Another day that we were very lucky to have beautiful weather was when we went by a place called Bodnant Gardens. You probably know that most Brits are obsessed with gardening and, excuse me, and also obsessed with botanical gardens and places where you can go to see a country home or and this is one of the better known ones in Wales. And it's also quite old. It has about 80 acres of public gardens that started in the 1870s, and also a gorgeous manor house that goes with it. You can't actually visit the house because it's still privately owned, believe it or not. I wouldn't mind having a house like this. But all of the public the garden areas are public. There are both formal and informal gardens, and they're absolutely gorgeous. So if you're into botany and gardening, garden centers, it's the kind of garden that is good to visit at various times of year because no matter when you're there, there's always something in bloom. We were there in I believe May. I'm forgetting what time we were there. I think it was May. There's beautiful topiary, sculpture gardens. The pavilion that you can see at the end of this long reflecting pool is actually an old pin mill, one where they actually made pins. And it was moved here from Gloucestershire and rebuilt as a folly on the property here. But the variety of flowers, and particularly in the spring when we were there, just incredibly beautiful. And there are a number of very nice walks through ponds and forests where you can see all kinds of things growing just off in the middle of nowhere. There are English meadows. Probably the most famous attraction here is a 160-foot long tunnel that is completely covered with laburnum vines, which at a particular time of year are completely in bloom and fragrant even, with these enormous yellow flowers. It's usually like the last tail end of May. And we were lucky enough to be there at the right time. The problem is trying to get a photograph of it without a million other tourists doing the same thing you are. But it's quite impressive to see this just long alley of nothing but a ceiling of yellow flowers arched over you. Another interesting tree that we came across, this looks like litter. And it's not. This is a tree that's originally from China. You can see the inset here. You can see these are flowers, and they look like pieces of tissue paper. So it's called the handkerchief tree. And in the late spring, it drops them all over the ground. Another town that we visited, we're now heading back, curving around towards the end, heading down to back down towards the south. And we stopped in this pleasant market town called Denbigh. And this is the library. As you know, I always need to stop and see a library. And one of the famous people who was born there is Stanley, the explorer from Africa. So here he is saying, "Mr. Klapes, I presume." You can shake his hand in the center of town. But it's a very nice town. There's not a lot of really much in the way of tourist things to do there, but it's a nice place to stop with restaurants and shops and good places to stay. There is a castle. Not much of it is left. Denbigh Castle is another one, yet another one, of Edward I's English fortifications, but this one did not really survive the centuries as well as many of the others did. And you can even see the remains of the church, which were started quite a bit later in the 1570s by Robert Dudley. You may remember him. He was the first Earl of Leicester, and he was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. But the church was never actually finished. So even though it's in ruins, it never actually was constructed much more than what you see here. Another town along this inland route is called Ruthven. Another beautiful market town with this very nice central square called St. Peter's Square. And it's known for its interesting variety of architecture from a number of different periods. You can see there's a clock tower in the center, and this famous building called the House of the Seven Eyes, which is from the 15th century. I love the image of all these dormers on this huge roof. And another very early 15th century building. This is the old courthouse, which now serves as a bank, but was built in 1401. And many of the buildings have this kind of typical half timbering. It's a very attractive town. The one that you're seeing in this photo actually is not old. This was built, believe it or not, in the 20th century, but it was specifically built to fit in with a lot of the other early designs throughout the town. There's that one again. We stayed a little further down the road in a town called Mold. If there's a town called Mold, you have to stay in it. It's just, you have to. And despite the funny name, it does have a couple of important sites. This is probably the biggest one. This is a 15th century parish church, and it's one of the best examples of parish architecture built in what's called the British perpendicular Gothic style, which is a very tall kind of look to it. And the decoration is really quite something. But Mold is also fun just because you can see things like "Hello Mold" on the local supermarket, or the Mold Library. But we stayed in a very nice place called, appropriately, Mold Tower, which was built in the 15th century and has been owned to this day by the exact same family for that entire time. The same family owns this house since the time it was built, and you can stay in it. There are several rooms, and it's not a particularly huge building, but in fact, this was our bedroom up here. And it's a very comfortable place. That actually, I should go back here. This was our bedroom. You can see like the 20-foot high ceilings. And there are some very comfortable public rooms. Here's the dining room where you can have breakfast. There's a very pleasant little lounge where you can play cards and read books. Here is a better view of our bedroom with the enormous window. And despite how fancy it really actually wasn't terribly expensive, and we booked it at the last minute. So it's worth it to kind of look for places like this that have a little bit of character when you're traveling around. It's much more fun than staying in more standard international kinds of hotels that don't really have much personality. Plus, you get a delicious home-cooked breakfast. Continuing down south, it's worth it to stop in this town called Llangollen, which is known mainly for its canal and its aqueduct, which you can see here in this photo. This was one of the earliest ones of its kind. And like a lot of the other things that we've seen so far, it's a really good example of industrial heritage. All of these engineering feats that were built as Britain was becoming an industrial power in the 19th century. So this canal, and it's hard to tell that this is actually a canal. This is not a bridge. You'll see a photo in a minute. There is water that goes across the top of this aqueduct. And it connects England and Wales because it's right near the border. So you can walk up to the top. Here's some views of just how monumental it is. And it carries the canal over this river valley. At its highest point, it's 126 feet up. And it was finished as early as 1805. And you can walk across it, or if you want, you can take a boat. And these boats are designed to be exactly the width necessary to cross it. So here we are. We walked, but here's a good example of what it was actually originally used for. Now, of course, obviously, it's just for tourism, but you can take a boat ride. You can paddle your own canoe, as this gentleman is doing. Or if you want, you can just walk across. But it's quite an impressive feat to be 120 feet up above a river while pushing a canal boat across this steep valley. Yeah, it was quite something, and even more so when you think that it was built over 200 years ago. In this area, we stayed in this pleasant little manor house, bed and breakfast, again, just off in the countryside in a town called Welshpool. The only problem here was you had to, in order to get to it, you had to drive through a very rutted road full of potholes and sheep. But that's what makes a vacation fun. Very close to this, in fact, if it weren't so foggy, you could probably see it across the valley, is the family home of the Clives, as in Clive of India. I don't know if you remember him. He was the basically the highest ranking official in the British Raj when the British were in India. And it is his family that owned this house. It's a major castle and that you can tour. And again, like many of the other country homes around here, there are extensive gardens and forests that you can wander around. But it's the house and the gardens that are the big attraction. You can see the castle up on the hill, which was originally started in the 13th century by a Welsh prince. So this is yet another castle that had nothing to do with British Edward. It has been significantly altered over the several hundred years since then, right up until the 20th century. And you can see some of the gardens and parks in the area as well. You can tour most of the interior of the house. And you can also just wander freely through the gardens, which are a mixture of both very formal and very informal gardens. In addition to all the rooms in the house, there's also some beautiful museums and unbelievable topiary. I've never quite seen this sort of melted, enormous melted shrubbery, which is obviously quite old. And because the house is perched up high, the gardens tend to be in terraces that go down the side of the hillside. So there are Italian gardens at the top with all this wisteria and sculpture. This is probably the most fantastic shrubbery I've ever seen anywhere. I can't imagine being the one that has to trim it. A little further down on the terrace is this orangery where they had tropical plants that they would bring in the winter. And you can wander through the forests. There are all kinds of beautiful woodland paths that take you through all kinds of interesting sculptures and follies, even a pet cemetery with tombstones from centuries worth of Clive family pets. And a number of the gardens are quite formal as well. The funny thing that you can see here, Clive forever, huzzah. His son, Edward, was a politician and a member of parliament around 1800. So that's why this interesting. I'm not sure today. Obviously, the way we do politics is very different. But back then, you could apparently buy a nice water pitcher with your candidate's name on it. If you like books, and since you all seem to be frequent patrons of the Chelmsford Library, I assume you fall into that category. If you ever get a chance to go to Hay on Wye, I would highly recommend it. It's right on the border with England. The Wye River, Hay on Wye, it's the Wye River in that area, is literally on the border between Wales and England. It's a small town. There's maybe 1,500 people that live in it, but there are 30 bookstores in this town. And it is also the home of one of the world's most famous annual literary and book festivals. And tens of thousands of people come every year. And we happened to be there at the time. We didn't plan it that way, but so we did stop by. And of course, it was much more crowded than it would normally be. Even without the festival, it's a beautiful little town. And there are thousands and thousands of people there. Here you can see another good example of the existence of Welsh language on a lot of the signs. And I found this interesting. I'm not sure if any of you know this story. Hay, the town of Hay, is twinned. It has a sister city in Timbuktu in Mali. You might wonder, what on earth does the town of Hay on Wye have to do with Timbuktu, and why would they consider them worth connecting? And that's another fascinating story that there are books about if you're interested in reading. You probably know that there is a lot of problems in Mali. Mali is in Saharan Africa. And there have been a lot of problems there with the Islamic State in Africa, committing all kinds of terrorist activity, and it's been a very dangerous place to travel for a number of years now. But Timbuktu, throughout history, has been known for being one of Africa's most important centers of the collection of historic documents. And that's not recent. This is something that goes back to medieval times, where as people were traveling across through the Sahara and across North Africa, libraries developed in Timbuktu. And there's an incredible collection of Islamic manuscripts, early manuscripts from all different kinds of civilizations that were collected there in libraries. And now that there are problems with the Islamic State there, they have come under it's a very dangerous situation for them. So there have been some heroic stories of the librarians of Timbuktu trying to, at great personal risk to themselves, smuggle as many of these valuable books and scrolls and documents and so forth out of Timbuktu to safety until such time as they can go back. And there's a number of books. One of the ones I might recommend, because it's a good introduction, is readily available in a number of libraries around here. It's called The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, it makes for a great read. And you'll understand why Hay, with its 30 bookstores, actually is a kindred spirit to this town. So far away in Africa. This was outside a bookstore, and I just liked this. I want to use this in my own library. Do you need a book? No, you're wrong. Get a book. But it's a wonderful town to if you like bookstores, particularly used bookstores. You could spend weeks there just wandering around. And the festival itself tends to close the town down. So you actually have to you park miles away and take a shuttle bus to get into town. But the good thing is once you're there, all the streets are blocked off, so it's all pedestrianized, which makes it much nicer once you're there. And the festival is actually just out of town, in a large area, open area, just within walking distance of the center of town. So they have tents and all kinds of activities with authors speaking and everything you could possibly imagine. It happens in late spring or late May, early June every year. I do have to point out in this picture a Welsh Terrier, which was the first one we saw. I used to have a Welsh Terrier years ago. They're lovely dogs, and this was, after having been in Wales for like 2 weeks, this was the first one we saw, so I was very excited. And plenty of books, new and used. Unfortunately, and I was very surprised by this, I had to go to the public library, which is probably the ugliest building in all of Hay. So I was kind of disappointed to see that. Not to mention the fact that it was closed. But do stop in Hay, regardless of what time you're there, just because it's a wonderful place to visit. And the bookstores are open all year round, whether the festival is going on or not. I believe usually, obviously the past couple of years with COVID, I'm sure have been completely different, but in a normal year, the festival draws about 250,000 people over a period of a week or so. And continuing to head south, we're almost all the way back towards Cardiff, and we're going to finish the program in a lovely valley very close to the Brecon Beacons, where we started the last program, in a place called Llanthony, which is a very narrow valley in the Black Mountains, which is the very eastern portion of the Brecon Beacons. And this is another one of those fun places that we stayed, because if you can stay in a ruined abbey, it's worth it to do so. So this is it. This isn't the part we stayed, I should emphasize that. This is the abbey. It's a priory that goes back to 1100. And after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, it fell into ruin. And so it really has never developed since then. This was our room way at the top of what was originally, if you can imagine this being a church, these would have been the two towers of the church on the west side, and this is the nave. So one of the towers is still ruined. This part of the this tower has been converted into guest rooms, and we had the one at the very top. And it's just, it's such an unusual place to stay. And to be able to look out of your window and see this. Bear in mind, it's in the middle of nowhere. There is no cell service here. I don't think there was any Wi-Fi, as I recall, or it was very bad. But boy, did they serve good breakfasts and dinners. This is the view from our room, way at the very top of the tower, looking out over and straight down into the nave of the old church. And then the following morning, this is what it looks like in the fog. So if you want a really unusual experience, I would highly recommend this place. And again, like some of the other historic places we stayed, it's nowhere near as expensive as you might think it is. It's actually about the same price as you'd pay to stay in a modern hotel almost anywhere else. The disadvantage to it, though, and this would depend on your own circumstances, is that there is no elevator. So if you do want to stay in one of the tower rooms, and they have some other rooms that aren't up that high, but if you want to stay in the tower rooms, there is uh, a spiral staircase with 55 steps, and the bathroom, which is a shared bathroom, is way down at the bottom. So if you are at the top floor like we were, and you wake up in the middle of the night and feel the call of nature, it's a long way down and a long way back up. But it makes for great stories. And then in the morning, if you've spent the middle of the night getting exercise, hiking up and down to the bathroom, at least in the morning you'll get this, which will fortify you. And it's, again, like so many other of these historic places, it really feels like you're going back in time. You could be in a 19th century novel. I enjoyed this little artwork that they had in the bar, the pub down in the basement, because this medieval print showing that you can actually get a little bit of Wi-Fi in this area. Also on the property is St. David's Church, which was the infirmary for the priory. And after the dissolution of the monasteries, it was rebuilt and is now a church, since the original church is in ruins. Believe it or not, since there's no cell reception, there is an actual working phone booth in the town of Lanthony. And when I say town, I mean the two houses on the street across from the priory. But to give you an idea of the green and pleasant land that is Wales, this is the landscape surrounding Lanthony. It's absolutely stunning. There's a lot of beautiful country walks that you can take here, and drives as well, particularly if you like sheep. And even just walking around the area where the priory is, you can go up into the hills and look down at it. It's just beautiful. And you, as much as you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, in about 20 minutes or so, you can get to some a little bit more of civilization, where there are some small towns that have restaurants and shops if you really feel like you're too far in the middle of nowhere. But it's beautiful countryside. Here's an example of that same laburnum tree that we saw at the botanical gardens. This is just a tree growing in someone's yard. And this long, low valley is just, you can imagine almost any one of these being the cover image of a travel guidebook for Wales. It's exactly what you picture when you think of the rural countryside, of the rural Welsh countryside. Very close to it is, and we did not go in here, but I'm pointing it out only because it's such a big tourist attraction. The Skirrid Inn claims to be the oldest pub in Wales, from 1100, although the building that you're looking at is actually from the 1600s. But the inn itself as an institution is almost, what, 1,000 years old? And of course, because it's so old, it is reputed to be haunted, so lots of tourist buses will stop there. And I fell in love with this little church, which is the Church of St. Iswi, which has a much more genuine history than the pub did. It's about the same age, was built in 1060, or the church was founded, I should say, in 1060, and then the church was gradually added onto. Much of what you see here is from the 14th century. But it's, you have to drive down a very long country road, dead ending in the middle of nowhere. You'll never get there without a GPS. But once you get there, it's just the most gorgeous little church, and it's known for this spectacular carved wooden rood screen. This is all hand-carved wood from 1500. Incredible detail. And several wall paintings, including this kind of macabre figure of death from the 17th century. And it's just, it's so peaceful. The likelihood of you're seeing anyone else there is very, very slim. And it's another wonderful way of feeling like you've gone back in time. And I'm going to end the program at Tintern Abbey, which is a much more famous attraction and much bigger, certainly much bigger than Lanthony where we stayed, but although not terribly far from it. And it's fairly close to Bristol. So if you were in that area, you could always scoot across and see it if you're interested in this. This is, here's an example of a map that shows you the original setup of the monastery or the abbey. And most of the foundations are still there, even if not all of the buildings are. But it's very well presented to give you an idea of what a medieval abbey would have been structured like and what the daily life for the monks would have been like. And certainly much more than at Lanthony, more of the structures are visible. This was a Cistercian abbey founded in the 1100s. Most of what you see here is from about 100 years later up through the 1600s. And of course, like so many others, after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, during his reign, many of those establishments they just fell apart and fell into romantic ruins that they remain today. This is the cloister, what's left of it. There's actually quite a bit of the nave left, including the tracery of the main windows, which are very impressive. And even some of the roof vaulting. This is the chapter house where the monks would have met every day. You can see the benches even around the side still, where monks would have gathered to read chapters from scripture. If nothing else, it's an incredibly atmospheric place to visit. And this is the caretaker's house right across the street. And I'll end with this because we didn't actually bother to look into this, and I should have. We saw this from across the valley. This is the Church of St. Martin of, I can't pronounce it. I won't even bother to try it. It's Cwmyoy. If you know your Welsh. It's a 12th century church, and it is considered the crookedest church in Britain. And you can certainly tell from the tower in the front that it looks like it's about to collapse at any minute. And that's the result of a landslip that happened at some point in the past, and it's kind of managed to stay up ever since then. But I'm going to end there, and I will stop sharing my screen. And okay, and now do feel free to unmute yourself, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them or try. I'd also love to hear if any of you have been to Wales or any of these places and you have stories you want to share. I'm happy to listen to those too. I always like to hear what other people's experiences were. Anyone? And were there any questions in the chat that I missed? Just taking a quick look through.
I don't think we had a question in the chat,
nope.
But Roz reminded us that Port Miriam, the sort of Italian experimental community, was the setting for the TV show The Prisoner.
Oh, The Prisoner. I forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. That's true. Oh, I guess people are going home. That's fine. No questions?
And just in case people wanted to
Yep.
see it, I did put in the chat the link to Castles in the Air, which we don't have here at the Chelmsford Library right now, but you can of course request it and we'll have it sent here to the library for you.
Yep, I would definitely recommend that. It's a wonderful read, even if you've never been to Wales, but if you've ever fixed up an old house, um, it's a great story. So if there aren't any questions, I want to thank you all. Glad you enjoyed the program, and I hope I will see many of you, I guess, in just another month. I'm not sure what we decided on, but we'll be going somewhere.
The votes were very split, so we'll have to have an ongoing discussion about that.
Well, we can, and don't forget, we can also do both. Not in the
Okay.
same night, but I'm happy to do as many of these programs as you're interested in. So,
folks love being here for them, and we love having you. So thank you all, everybody.
thanks very much. See you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jeff.